Good evening. It's really good to be here tonight. If you want to go ahead and open up your Bibles to 1 Corinthians 1, that's where we're going to be here in just a minute. 1 Corinthians chapter 1. Now, you'll probably recognize that what I have on the screen there, Christ and Him crucified, is a line that comes in 1 Corinthians 2 and in verse 2. And that's a pretty powerful line that Paul uses there. Makes for pretty good bulletin board material, I would say. I'm determined to know nothing among you except Jesus Christ and Him crucified. I feel like if Paul were preaching a sermon, kind of like a campaign speech, this would be the moment where he kind of has to step away from the mic because everyone's going crazy or something like that. That's a really good line. I'm determined to know nothing among you except Christ and Him crucified. But I remember talking to someone a while back. I mentioned that verse, and his response was, "Yeah, but why that? Why Christ and Him crucified?" He could have said any number of things. And I thought that was a pretty good observation, something I hadn't really considered before. Why does Paul say, I'm determined to know nothing among you except Christ and Him crucified? Because if he were to have said, I'm determined to know nothing among you except Christ and His resurrection, would anyone bat an eye at that? Certainly not. He goes to that even at the end of the book. So it's of first importance, right? Chapter 15. Or if he were to say, I'm determined to know nothing among you except Christ and His love, would that be good? Or Christ and His brilliant teaching. I mean, all of those things would be good and an accurate thing to state. But that's not what he says. What is it about Christ and Him crucified? What is it about that was more necessary for the Corinthians at this time than those other things? This evening, I want to explore that question. And I'll be honest, as I was preparing for this lesson, I was really building it around this phrase. And as I started to explore the meaning behind this and kind of the context here, it ended up taking me somewhere I did not anticipate going, which is a pretty good sign, because it means I'm following the text more so than just what I want to preach on, because I had something entirely different in mind. But again, as I continued studying this, it ended up taking me somewhere completely different. We're pretty much going to be in 1 Corinthians 1 through 4 this evening. And if you've ever been in a class of 1st or 2nd Corinthians, most likely the teacher will make some sort of note of just how immoral of a city Corinth was. And there's good reason to make that kind of point. Corinth was a pretty big city, full of shady people doing a lot of shady things. And so immorality for sure crept into the church, and that's addressed in chapter 5 and in other places as well. And Paul addresses those things. But what's interesting is that he spends really the majority of time in this book not addressing some sort of immorality, sexual immorality. What he addresses in the first 4 chapters of this book is really the problem of pride and division. Corinth had a pride problem. 1 Corinthians 1 and verse 12, he addresses the I am of problem. You're familiar with that? Remember, these people are kind of fighting, drawing lines of division. Paul calls this, and later on in chapter 3 and in verse 3, jealousy and strife. All of these things are happening, it seems as though, based on who taught them the gospel or who baptized them. That they are kind of splintering off and making comparisons as to who is better simply based on who it was that brought them the gospel. And people are making these comparisons. You can imagine, like, one person is saying, I was baptized by Paul. And the other person's like, yeah, well, I was baptized by Peter. You remember Peter, right? I mean, he was the guy he was with Jesus from the very beginning upon this rock, right? There's a lot about Peter. Yeah, but Apollos taught me the gospel. And I don't know if you've ever heard Apollos preach before. I don't know if you've ever heard him speak, but no one sounds like Apollos. You can kind of imagine these conversations that would be going on. And what's interesting is that Paul's response to these divisions is Christ and Him crucified. Determined to know nothing among you except Christ and Him crucified. And Paul, in this, he will label their error in what they're doing. And then he's going to address that error, that worldly, divisive spirit with the cross every single time. And I'm not sure what's going on with the PowerPoint. Yeah, we're a little Go backwards. There we go. It's really not that important. You'll hear me. It's going to be the same thing that's on the board. What he does every single time when he's correcting these errors is he comes back to the cross. And in chapter 1 and verse 17, kind of addressing the first part of this error, part of this problem, is he says that he was sent to preach the gospel, but not in cleverness of speech. That's not why he was sent. It's interesting, that phrase is used by Paul, I believe, to expose their worldly thought, though culturally appropriate way of thinking. This is how the world works around them, that you get people who are really good at speaking. Paul will even make allusions to this later when he says, hey, where is the wise man? Where is the debater of this age? The wise men and the debaters were like celebrities of their time. They were the entertainment source. But beyond that, it was a huge deal because you went to these public debates and speeches and stuff like that because these people not only were really talented, but they were talking about really important things. And so people gathered around these people and they listened to them. They followed them. It's a philosophical group by the name of the Sophists. I don't know if you've ever heard of them. That name, sophist, literally means wisdom. Sort of words like sophisticated, philosophy, it really comes from that idea. But these people gained prominence in Athens as well as other major cities like Corinth not long before the first century. And these were the wise men of the age who really traveled from city to city speaking their wisdom, really speaking about all the problems of the world and providing their solutions, what they thought would be solutions to these problems. And they would draw these huge crowds and stuff like that. And what's unique, well, I shouldn't say unique, but what's particular about these sophists is that they were so talented in public speaking and in rhetoric and stuff like that. They could speak on things that they really knew nothing about, but entertain the crowd, and not only that, impress them and even persuade them, even though they weren't making that much sense. Plato, who was not a sophist, you've probably heard of him, he describes these individuals as paid hunters of the young and wealthy. Paid hunters of the young and wealthy. He calls them shadows of the true. These people had mastered the art of presentation, essentially. They were able to create the illusion of deep thinking without really saying anything of value. But they would go on these circuits and they'd be able to speak to all of these different cities. They would have these followings who would not only follow them, but they would donate money to them. And they would go to these different cities and say, here's all the problems in the world. Here's how I can fix them. Here's what I can do. They were even paid good money, not only by their followers, but they would become these tutors of these rich aristocrats and stuff like that. So, you got people who travel around proclaiming their wisdom, proclaiming how the world works and how they're going to solve problems. They're highly skilled in speech, debate, and showmanship and stuff like that. They have a devoted following who is willing to give them money. Does that sound like anything to you? Or does that ring any bells? I can't help but think of American politics when I hear something like that. I mean, not only that, sophists didn't have like any set teaching. And so you would have one sophist stand over here and he would say a bunch of stuff. Then there'd be another sophist over here and he'd say a bunch of stuff. And then they would debate about these things. And then the followers of each individual would then go debate about again, I'm not making this stuff up. Does that sound familiar to you? And the Corinthians had brought that type of thinking, that type of worship of man into the church. And they divided over these things. And they did that because it was just the wisdom of the age. Because this is how the world works. This is what you do. Is that what we do? I'm going to guess we don't have a problem here of attaching ourselves to a favorite teacher or preacher or elder or something like that. Maybe you do. But I think the better question is, do we get swept up by certain politicians or entertainers, musicians, talk show hosts, podcasters, YouTubers, Instagram influencers, and stuff like that? Do we get wrapped up in what it is that they're providing, what it is that they offer, looking to them for the answers to our questions and worldly problems and stuff like that? Do we get swept up into their way of thinking because they're just really clever? They have really good lines. They have really good turn of phrase, and they really just owned this other guy in some debate on YouTube, and so I really like them. Like, is that really what we're drawn to? Or do we sometimes inadvertently pattern our own actions after them? Paul says in 1 Corinthians 2 and verse 1, when I came to you proclaiming the word of God, he says, I didn't talk like that. I didn't speak in that kind of wisdom. In fact, in chapter 2 and verse 3, he says he spoke with much fear and trembling. That's how Paul presented himself. Is that because that's all Paul was capable of? I'm of the opinion Paul could have spoken just as well as any of these other guys. After all, Galatians talked about how he was above everyone else in his class and things like that, super well educated. Paul could have, but did he? No. If you go back to verse 17 of chapter 1, Paul says that if he were to teach in that way, in this cleverness of speech, that it would make void or empty the power of, or make ineffective the cross of Christ. If he were to speak and be determined to have the most clever speech of them all, it would somehow make void the cross of Christ. Why is that? What is it about the cross of Christ that opposes this cleverness of speech mentality? Well, because the image of Christ and him crucified is just completely counter to what the world looks for. Because while the world looks for someone who is crafty, maybe even easy to look at or attractive, one who flaunts their stately form and majesty, the cross points to a suffering servant who had none of those things. And the cross stands as a symbol of everything that is opposite to that. So to decorate the cross with like frills and to saturate it in just clever speech meant only to exalt the one who is speaking would completely diminish the meaning of the cross. But what do we say about the cross when our actions reflect the same worldly attitude that these Corinthians are after? When we chase after all of these powerful and clever leaders who really only carry with them the wisdom of the world, determined to know nothing among you except Christ and him crucified. Paul shifts his attention then to the wisdom of the world. Following chapter 1 and verse 17, Paul launches an indictment of the wisdom of the world. He says the word of the cross, that is like the message of the cross, is foolishness. It is foolishness in the eyes of the world. It's ridiculous. It doesn't make sense in light of these rhetorically skilled political entertainers. But it also just doesn't make sense in light of the wisdom of the world. So I mentioned before the sophists. If I could launch back into Greek history a little bit more. The sophists were more focused on the artful arrangement of words and stuff like that. But the Stoics, it's a group that's actually mentioned in Acts chapter 17. The Stoics, who actually hated the sophists, by the way, they focused more on the message. You ever heard of Plato, Aristotle, Socrates? Morons. No, these are really smart people, intelligent people, highly intelligent philosophers. But I would argue that they had the same amount of pride as the sophists. But their pride was centered more in their actual understanding of the world rather than just their speaking abilities. And so they really prided themselves on having this higher moral integrity, because we're not like these actors over here. We're not just performing. We have actual knowledge here, and I'll show you that. They saw themselves as better than other people. And so for hundreds of years in Athens and in Corinth and the surrounding area, their philosophy became highly influential. It didn't replace the temple gods of their time, but it certainly did become a religion all its own. You remember in Acts chapter 17, it's the Stoics and the Epicureans who hear the message of the resurrection and just completely scoff at that. Is that because they were, why would a group that worships at the temple and believes in all of these other gods, why would they scoff at the resurrection? It's because they didn't really believe in those other things as much. They were worshiping their own intellect, their own wisdom. Here's one summary from a famous Stoic by the name of Epictetus. He says, "For as the material of the carpenter is wood, and that of statuary," so building statues, bronze, "so the subject matter of the art of living," what a phrase that is, "so the subject matter of the art of living is each person's own life." Essentially, the art of living, or how to live it beautifully in whatever way, it's going to be in the eye of the beholder, right? It's going to be based on one's own interpretation of one's own life. Whatever it is that you see. Do we hear that kind of stuff today? Like, you could just observe the natural world and you can get an idea of how to live your life. Just observe your own life. You'll get an idea of what you should do. Now, I will say you can see how this line of thinking could be used really to justify anything. And we see a lot of that in this day. But these Stoics really did practice self-control and integrity. However, they didn't do it because it was better for other people or it was better for mankind. They did it simply because if you want to live a better life and have a more fulfilling life, this is the way to do it. You see, it was still more self-seeking than anything else. And so Stoics shared the same elitist attitude as the Sophists. Plato even writes, "It is for the ignorant to follow the wise men, and the wise men to take over and rule." There was a certain foolishness to people who didn't think on their level. And so, like the Sophists, there were Stoic teachers who earned a following as well, and people went after them. Now, I do believe Paul's attack is mostly on this Gentile sense of wisdom, but you can see how there was some Jewish elitism that was going on during Jesus' day and in Paul's day and stuff like that. The Pharisees prided themselves on their own knowledge of the law. Rabbis had their own following and stuff like that. So it's not difficult to see how this type of thinking would find itself into the church, in a young church at that. Again, it's easy to think of Corinth as just a place of immorality, but this is a place of status and pride. And so Paul exposes this type of party mindset. When he's doing that, he's exposing really a pervasive cultural value system. That's a difficult thing to address. Because this is not just like, hey, change a few things in your life. Stop doing this or stop doing that. This is like changing you at your core. That's a difficult thing to do. Paul says later in chapter 1 and verse 22, Jews ask for a sign, and Greeks search for wisdom. Now, if I could add to that, if you'll allow me, Jews ask for a sign, Greeks search for wisdom, Americans desire what? How would you fill in the blank there? I actually crowdsourced this question. I asked a lot of different people and got a lot of really good responses. This is kind of a consolidated list of them. One said, Jews ask for a sign, the Greeks search for wisdom, Americans desire a winner. That's what we like. That's what we value. You can certainly see that in our age. Our culture values and follows those who win, regardless of their morality, regardless of the sketchy means by which they achieve their success. And you could put it in any line of any category: politicians, entertainers, musicians, athletes, However they gain their success, we just applaud the fact that they somehow scrape their way to the top. We admire the strong and successful, oftentimes to the shame of the weak and vulnerable. We honor those who refuse to take no for an answer, who blaze their own trail and just leave everyone else in their dust. Another person said, Jews ask for a sign, the Greeks search for wisdom, and Americans desire self-care. It's kind of that airplane mentality. When the mask falls down, you put it on yourself first and then your kids. Anyone else going like some moral dilemma anytime they talk about that on a plane? Like that feels weird to do that, but that's what they say to do, so you do it. I guess. I don't know. I've never been in that situation. But that's what they say to do. And I think we often use that in our life. I really can't give myself to you because I'm empty. I don't have anything to give. I need to take care of myself. I need to fill myself up first before I can give to anyone else. But once I do, whenever I feel as though I'm filled up sufficiently, then I'll get around to it to help others. Jews ask for a sign, the Greeks search for wisdom, Americans demand their rights. Sometimes regardless of the effect it may have on others, regardless of whether there's any truth behind it or not, really, so long as it remotely fits under my interpretation of the first 10 amendments, I have the right to do it, and so I will do it. Yeah, Paul addresses that in 1 Corinthians. All things are lawful, not all things are profitable. Jews ask for a sign, the Greeks search for wisdom, Americans demand change. He not busy being born is busy dying. If we're not constantly trying to reinvent ourselves and progress, then we're really moving backwards. Newer is always better. Jews ask for a sign, the Greeks search for wisdom, Americans demand tolerance and acceptance. You go your way and I'll go mine. That's not enough. You must applaud me as I go my way. You must support me in the way that I go, regardless of whether it's true, whether it's good, or how it affects other people. Well, in comes the message of Christ crucified. From a worldly perspective, do you see the cross in any of these things that people desire? Again, this is foolishness to the world. But why is that? Well, the cross is the epitome of selflessness. And that really is, of course, contrary to all of the things the Jews, the Greeks, and our culture seeks. And when Paul says the cross, he's really using a part to represent the whole. In the literary world, we call that synecdoche, right? When one part is really representing all of it. So if I were to say, hey, you got a nice set of wheels over there, I'm not really talking about your wheels, I'm talking about the whole car, right? The wheels represent the whole. And so here is the cross. The cross is really representing everything. That's how Paul is using it. The cross represents everything about Jesus. It is the symbol of the gospel. It's the symbol of Jesus' whole life. Paul really talks about this in Philippians chapter 2. How Jesus left heaven to come to earth. You understand that's a downgrade, right? That isn't what most people would desire. And yet that's what the cross shows. He had the form of God, and yet he took on the form of flesh. That's a downgrade, right? Paul goes on to talk about his whole life and how he emptied himself and how he became a slave for other people. Is that the way the world does it? He humbled himself throughout his life. But of course, the greatest act of humility was when he hung on that cross, completely deserted by all of his followers. You see, the phrase Christ and him crucified is in itself kind of contradictory. Right? At least based on the world's view of what wisdom is, it's contradictory. I mean, the meaning of Christ is the anointed one, right? It's often used of kings and other people who are in leadership positions. So you're telling me that the king is crucified? That doesn't make any sense. He uses similar terms as he goes on. We saw earlier in chapter 1 and verse 17, the cross of Christ. Chapter 1 and verse 23, we preach Christ crucified. Then we see later in chapter 2 and in verse 8, he crucified the Lord or master or ruler of glory. You see, that doesn't make any sense. I mean, that can't happen. Royalty is not crucified. And if he is, well, that's a terrible failure on his part, or at least on the part of his platform or whatever. But we know the cross is not a failure. Now, all of these things that the Jews, the Greeks, and that we desire in our culture, the cross is all of those things. The Jews sought a sign. They wanted some grand gesture from God. Well, that's exactly what the cross was. It was the ultimate sign of a new kingdom. They wanted the good news, the gospel, as Isaiah talks about, that is in the cross. The Greeks searched for wisdom. The cross is a proclamation of wisdom. In fact, Paul writes in chapter 2 and verse 4, my message and my preaching were not in persuasive words of wisdom, but in demonstration of the Spirit and of power, so that your faith would not rest on the wisdom of men, but on the power of God. Yet we do speak wisdom to those who are mature. Then later in verse 14, he says, but a natural man does not accept the things of the Spirit of God, for they are foolishness to him. He cannot understand them. It's interesting, that phrase, natural man, in Greek, was actually one of the highest compliments you could give to a Greek philosopher. Because you know what that meant? That meant, man, you are a keen observer of the world. You are able to draw all these conclusions. You are a true intellectual. You see how Paul's using that? He's using it as an insult. You're too much of a natural man to really see this. There is wisdom in the cross. But are you too natural or unspiritual or worldly to see it? But then we look at the things that we desire as well. I've been clicking away. You see the things we desire as well. We seek a winner. Despite the failure, or despite the appearance of failure on the cross, it is anything but that. Christ gives us the ultimate victory in the cross. It's just not going to be the same victory that we desire in this world. It's certainly not going to be achieved in the same way that people of the world achieve their victories. And we seek self-care. We want to stop feeling so anxious, so tired, and so beat down all the time. We want to actually feel good about ourselves one of these days. We want to feel more confident. Look to the cross. Why is it that Paul can say in 2 Corinthians 4, if I can venture outside of 1 Corinthians for a second, why is it that Paul can say in 2 Corinthians 4, we are afflicted in every way, but not crushed, perplexed, but not despairing, persecuted, but not forsaken, struck down, but not destroyed? Why is it that Paul can say these things? Well, in the very next line, he says, because always carrying about in the body the dying of Jesus. You know what Paul had on his heart? The cross. You know what Paul had his eyes fixated on? The cross. So why was he able to endure all of these things? Because of Christ and him crucified. We seek our rights. Through the cross, we have the right to become children of God, John 1 and verse 13. We seek a change in the world. Well, it's through the cross that the ultimate change, the change that we really need and our world really needs, it's found in the cross. We seek tolerance and acceptance, and that's a beautiful thing about the cross, is everyone finds the right sacrifice on the cross. You look in the old law, when certain sacrifices were being given, there were different sacrifices. Because if you were poor, you weren't able to offer the same things. Now there was accommodations that were given, but you can see a distinction that's made there. Not on the cross. Jesus on the cross is a sacrifice for everyone. And Jesus accepts you. No matter who you are, where you come from, or what you've done. And Jesus will change you. Every single one of us. The cross is foolishness to those who are perishing. But to us who are being saved, it is the power of God. There's one last thing that Paul addresses, and I promise I'll move faster than the others. He kind of wraps up this section in chapter 4. He shifts his attention away from the foolish messengers and the foolish wisdom of the world to the Corinthians themselves. He calls them out for their arrogance towards one another. Just as the world around them, the Corinthians saw themselves as better simply because of who they attached themselves to. Simply because of worldly associations. But look at what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 4 and verse 7. For who regards you as superior? What do you have that you did not receive? And if you did receive it, why do you boast as if you had not received it? You think you're better than other Christians simply because of who taught you the gospel? Simply because of who baptized you? Like what did you do in this situation? How did you contribute to this? I mean, there's absolutely no reason for you to boast in this. And I actually think there's a larger point that's being made, if I can kind of step aside here. I think what Paul is saying really attributes to everything. What do we have in this life that has not been given to us? You think you're really good looking? You can thank your parents for that. I mean, what did you do to contribute to that? You got a lot of money? Who's paying you? I mean, we have to step back and consider. I mean, we do a good job, I think, of thanking God for all of these blessings, certainly in the last few weeks, right? We're thanking God for all of these great things that we have, but then sometimes we step away and we begin to boast, maybe publicly, but most of the time in our heads, about all these great things that we have. And most often that boasting comes about when we start comparing ourselves to the guy next to us. I think that's a point to be made from this verse. But I think one thing Paul is getting to is I think Paul is saying that, look, you're boasting because of your association with us? Like, do you know who we are? In chapter 4, verse 13, he calls themselves the scum of the earth, the dregs of all things. Like, we're nothing. And yet you're considering yourself better because of your association with us? Verse 9, he says, we become a spectacle to the world, and not in a good way. Paul and company became what Jesus became. They had carried their own crosses. They'd become foolishness to the world, and yet they're boasting in this worldly way. Look at what Paul says earlier in this chapter, verses 3 and 4. Chapter 4 and verses 3 and 4, he says, but to me it is a very small thing that I may be examined by you, or by any human court. In fact, I do not even examine myself, for I am conscious of nothing against myself. Yet I am not by this acquitted, but the one who examines me is the Lord. You see, Paul doesn't care about what any of them think about him. By the way, this isn't some like worldly way of thinking about it. Like, I don't care what anyone says about me. I'm going to do whatever it is that I want. It's not that kind of prideful thing. He doesn't care about how other people consider him. You know what? He doesn't even care about how he considers himself. All Paul is considerate of is what the Lord thinks about him. Because Paul is, as he says in chapter 4 and verse 1, just a servant of Christ. That's what all of us ought to be. We're not trying to gain any following. We're not trying to be just the most clever person around or boast in the wisdom of the world or things like that. May we not attach ourselves to people who do. We need to be true followers of Christ. While the world seeks a savior in man or in a party, may our identity be wrapped up in Christ, in him alone. May people look at us and say, like, I just don't get it. Why aren't y'all so troubled by all of these things that are going around and stuff like that? Why aren't you hopping on the latest bandwagon or something like that? What's so different about y'all? May our behavior reflect the foolishness of the cross. Let us not deceive ourselves, Paul says, chapter 3 and verse 18. If any man among you thinks that he is wise in this age, may he become foolish, so that he may become wise. And let us not follow so passionately people who are wise in this age. May our lives reflect one who is determined to know nothing but Christ and him crucified. I want to end by looking at the words of a familiar song, When I Survey the Wondrous Cross. When I survey the wondrous cross on which the Prince of Glory died. You see the language of 1 Corinthians 2 right there? The Lord of glory, the Prince of glory. When I survey the wondrous cross on which the Prince of Glory died, my richest gain I count but loss, and pour contempt on all my pride. Forbid it, Lord, that I should boast, save, or accept in the death of Christ my Lord. All the vain things that charm me most, I sacrifice them to his blood. So often I've attributed that to all these worldly possessions, but my mind as well, and the things I grab onto in this world. My ideals, my pride. May I sacrifice them all to his blood. See from his head, his hands, his feet, sorrow and love flow mingled down. Did ever such love and sorrow meet? Or thorns compose so rich a crown? Were the whole realm of nature mine? If I had everything in this world, that were a present far too small. Love so amazing, so divine, demands my soul, my life, my all. If you are not a Christian, I'd love to talk to you more about the cross of Christ. I want you to consider the cross more. I hope that this lesson has pricked you in a way that would make you consider Jesus more. I want you to see someone who has endured such pain so that you would have a Savior. That you wouldn't have to seek for one in this world, but that you would look at the cross. I want to tell you more about the victory that is won through Jesus on the cross. And I hope that you would be more and more curious and want to know more about him. If you're ready to make that commitment, we can make that happen tonight. If you know you need to reevaluate your life, we're going to sing a song. And as we're singing that song, I hope you would do so. You would be pricked to the heart. Consider what you need to do to make your life